Hello everyone, my name is Travel Ted and I am a travelling bear. Today I am going to tell you a story about the day I spent at Zoo Marine with my best friends Ben and Annie and our other best friend Everywhere Bear. It was a very hot day and Mr. Booger had just parked the car at Zoo Marine. We could see the big sign and underneath the sign there was a picture of dolphins with the words Dolphin Emotions. We were very excited that we were going to see a dolphin show, and as we got out of the car, Mrs. Booger had to warn us to be careful of the road because we were all so busy chatting about how brilliant it was going to be. Mr. Booger bought the tickets and we took it in turns to walk through a turnstile. It made a very funny ticking sound as we pushed our way through. Just inside there was a small stream with fish in it, and they were swimming up and down. Some of them were very, very big indeed. We had only walked a little way when we saw a sign saying Seal and Sea Lion Show. "Can we go in?" Annie asked Mr. and Mrs. Booker. Yes, can we? Can we please?" Ben cried, and Mr. and Mrs. Booker agreed that we could. When we went in, there was a big tank of water in front of the stage, which was painted to look like a beach, and just above it was a model of a big wooden ship. A man came out onto the ship dressed as a sailor, and he pretended that he was shipwrecked on a desert island. The person telling the story explained that the man had no friends on the island except for the seals and the sea lions. The man climbed down from the ship and onto the stage. Just then, a sea lion waddled out onto the stage and flapped his flippers at the crowd. He was grey, with black spots all over him, which were sort of joined together. Mrs. Booker said that he was dappled. We all clapped when we saw the sea lion, and he followed the man as he walked along the stage. When the man stopped, the sea lion stopped, and when the man walked, the sea lion walked too. The man stopped and pretended to look out to sea, and just then, the sea lion ran through his legs. We all laughed very hard when the man fell over on his bottom, splat. Each time the sea lion did a trick, the man gave him a piece of fish, and Mrs. Booker explained that the fish was a reward for the sea lion to say thank you for doing the trick, because sea lions love fish. Next, a seal came out onto the stage. He was different to the sea lion and much bigger. The seal was very shiny and had smooth black skin. The seal followed the man up and down the stage like the sea lion, and then he jumped into the water with a big splash. He swam up and down and round and around. The seal was clumsy waddling on the stage, but in the water he was a very, very good swimmer, and I wish that I could swim like that. He was very graceful. We watched the seal in the water through the glass, and at the end of the show, he jumped out of the water and up onto a big platform at the front of the tank. He waved his flipper at us, and he was so close that Annie got a little bit wet. She didn't like that very much, but we all waved back at the seal, and I think he liked it. When we came out from seeing the sea lions, we saw another sign for a bird show, but we were too early, so while we waited, Mr. Booker walked us through the bird enclosure. There were so many birds, and they were all so very, very different. Some were very big, and some were very small. Some were sitting on the water, and others were sitting high in the trees. I liked the birds, and I especially liked looking at all of the different colours. There were yellow birds and white birds, black birds and green birds. There were even bright pink birds and birds who had lots of different coloured feathers in yellows, blues and greens. Ben was looking at a bird high in a tree when a duck waddled up behind him and quacked, "Quack, quack, quack, quack." Ben said that it didn't frighten him, but I saw him jump out of his skin. When we got to the bird show, there were even more birds, and we watched them as they soared high above us in the sky. We were all excited when the owl came out and clapped very hard. "I've never seen an owl before," I said. And Mr. Booker explained that's because owls were nocturnal, which meant they only really came out at night. Some of the birds were very, very big, and some were very, very small. Some flew on their own, and others flew in groups, which Mrs. Booker said were called flocks. Some even did tricks, and I especially liked it when one took a piece of paper from a lady in the crowd and delivered it to the man who was doing the show. I liked that trick and said to Ben how very, very clever that bird was. After the show, Mr. Booker said that we were going to visit the water park, and we were all very excited as we ran into the water and splashed around. There were lots of pools with slides and climbing frames in them, and on the top of one of the climbing frames there was a big bucket which was slowly filling up with water. When the water was full, it tipped over and sprayed water everywhere. Ben dared Annie to stand underneath the big bucket and get splashed, but Annie didn't want to. I didn't want to get splashed either, so Everywhere Bear and Ben stood underneath it together and waited for the bucket to fill up and topple over. Ben and Everywhere Bear waited and waited for the bucket to tip. Annie and I waited and waited for the bucket to tip, and Mr. and Mrs. Booker waited and waited for the bucket to tip too. The bucket really did take a very long time to fill up. We were all getting very impatient. Ben shouted up at the bucket, "Come on, bucket, are you scared?" And just as he did, over it went, pouring water all over his head. Whoosh! There was so much water in the bucket that it almost knocked Ben over, but he managed to stay standing up. Everywhere Bear was not so lucky, and he fell backwards onto his bottom. Bump! That's when he started crying, and Mrs. Booker had to run over and pick him up. Mrs. Booker said that perhaps it was time to go and do something else now, and Everywhere Bear nodded that he agreed. He nodded a lot. "Can we go on the river rapids, please?" Ben asked Mr. and Mrs. Booker excitedly, pointing at the sign for them, and Annie, Everywhere Bear and I clapped our hands and joined in saying, "Oh yes, yes, can we please?" Mr. and Mrs. Booker agreed that we could. When we got there, we all climbed into a little round boat and set off over the bubbling water. The boat went up and down and round and around, and it was great fun. But then, suddenly, we came to a waterfall, and as we went under it, a big gush of water fell on Mrs. Booker's head. Splosh! Mrs. Booker shrieked. She said that the water was very, very cold, and we all laughed at her because she looked very, very wet and very, very funny. Mrs. Booker didn't mind us laughing though, because she was laughing too. Next, we went on a big water slide with bumps, and as we came down, Mr. Booker took photographs of us, and we all waved at the camera. It was time for lunch, and at the restaurant, Mr. Booker bought us all crepes. Mr. and Mrs. Booker had sugar and lemon on theirs, but Annie, Ben and I had chocolate. They were delicious, but Everywhere Bear said that he wasn't hungry. I think that was because Ben kept calling them creepies. Ben ate 2 crepes. He ate his own crepe and he ate Everywhere Bear's crepe too. Mrs. Booker said that she was surprised Ben didn't get a sick tummy, he ate so much. It was nearly time for the dolphin show, and we wanted to get there early so that we could sit near the front. But on the way, Mr. Booker said that we still had a few minutes to stop and buy a slush puppy ice drink because it was very, very hot. Annie and I chose a red one, and Ben and Everywhere Bear chose a bright blue one. They spent the rest of the afternoon poking their tongues out and laughing because the drinks had made their tongues turn completely blue. They really did look very funny. At last it was time for the dolphin show. On the way in, a man asked Annie and I if we would like to join in the show. We were taken to the stage behind another huge tank of water, and one of the ladies from the show put yellow life jackets on us and helped us into a little boat with a piece of rope tied to the front. We didn't know what to expect, but when the dolphins came out, they pulled the boat along using the rope. They pulled us around and around the pool in the boat, and everyone cheered and clapped at the clever dolphins. After our ride, we went and sat back with Mr. and Mrs. Booker near the front, but Ben and Everywhere Bear were sulking because they didn't get a ride. It didn't last long though, because soon the dolphins were doing all kinds of tricks. First, the dolphins swam around in circles and made lots of different shapes in the water using their bodies. Then they swam up onto the side of the tank to take fish from the trainer lady's hand. I remembered what Mrs. Booker had said about the seals and the sea lions, and knew that the fish was the dolphins' reward for doing the tricks so well. Back in the water, the dolphins pushed the trainer ladies along in the water, and one even got to ride standing up on the dolphins' backs. I said the dolphins could do much better tricks than the seals and the sea lions, and Mrs. Booker explained that that's because dolphins are very, very clever. The trainer lady used a microphone to tell us that the dolphins were mammals and needed to breathe. Then she put the microphone close to the dolphins so that we could hear them making breathing sounds. The end of the show was just brilliant, and my little legs were shaking as I watched the dolphins jumping high out of the water. Sometimes they jumped on their own, and sometimes they jumped together, but every time they jumped very, very high and landed back in the water with a big splash. Splish! Dolphins are just beautiful, Annie sighed, and I agreed that dolphins definitely were very beautiful indeed. When the show had ended, it was almost time to go home, but Mrs. Booker said we could walk through the aquarium and ride on the fairground rides. The aquarium was dark, and we got to see all sorts of fish in every colour you can imagine. Some were very, very tiny, and some were very, very big. We even saw a shark, which was very, very scary in its tank. At the end, there was a petting pool, and Mr. Booker took it in turns to lift us up so that we could touch the stingrays on the back. They were very wet and very slimy. There were starfish too, and I thought how beautiful the orange starfish was as I held it gently in my hand under the water. Outside the aquarium, we all rushed over to the carousel, and Annie and I got to sit on a pretty white horse with ribbons and bells on. We waved at Mr. and Mrs. Booker as the horse went up and down and around and around. Ben and Everywhere Bear chose to ride in a big shiny red car, and as they went around they honked the car horn at Mr. and Mrs. Booker. Beep, 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 they went. It was very loud. Finally, we got to ride on the roller coaster, and we all put our arms up into the air as we went over the bumps. Whoosh! It really did make our tummies feel very funny, but we didn't mind. We loved it. And when we were finished, Mr. and Mrs. Booker agreed that we could all go on again. When we had finished the second ride, we ran around again for a third turn. It really was a lot of fun, but when we asked for a fourth go, Mr. and Mrs. Booker said that it probably wasn't a good idea, as we might get sick tummies. My tummy was starting to feel a little bit sick, but I didn't say anything because Ben was busy saying that he was very tough and would never feel sick. I didn't want to seem like I wasn't brave, so I kept quiet. We were disappointed to be going home, but we'd enjoyed our day a lot. On the way back in the car, I sat quietly and thought about how much I would like to be a dolphin. Annie, Ben, and Everywhere Bear were all looking out of the windows and were being very quiet too. Mrs. Booker looked around and said to us, "What are you all thinking?" We all answered at exactly the same time, and we all said the same thing. "We want to be dolphins!"